Funerals smell of lilies and regret, but the first thing I tasted that day was betrayal. They placed Alice at the altar like a figure in a painting. The pastor spoke of vows, and faces I'd known for decades drifted by. I sat in the front pew because I had nowhere else to go. 38 years beside Alice had taught me how to breathe with someone else's breath. Her death broke that rhythm and left me winded. The church was heavy with condolence cards and the coldness of small talk, but it was the whispers behind me that cut deepest. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from and drop your take in the comments as you watch. Share your reaction, opinions, and what you think really happened. I read them all. We'll be giving shoutouts to standout comments and videos in the next upload, so make sure yours counts. Finally, it's over, Hunter said, his voice sliding across the hymn book like cold water. Aiden snorted. Luna, my daughter, smiled without sympathy, as if a weight had been lifted. Their laughter was quiet and surgical. Grief was there, raw and immediate, but trailing it like a shadow was betrayal. The words grief, betrayal, and coldness were not ideas that afternoon. They were a pressure on my chest. After the funeral, the errands of mourning began. Casseroles, calls, and the long, awkward arranging of affairs. The will reading was a week later in Camila Martinez's oak-paneled office. Camila had been Alice's attorney for years. She had the calm of someone who knew how to translate love into legalities. I sat across from her with the sealed envelope in my hands. Alice's looping handwriting a private map on its face. Camila read the will with clinical steadiness. Alice Baker leaves $22 million to Hunter, Aiden, and Luna, plus 6 vehicles purchased in their names. A murmur of delight shifted into glee. Faces around the table brightened with predatory light. Camila's tone altered as she continued. To her husband, Easton Baker, she leaves this sealed letter. The room reacted as if I'd been slapped. Aiden's brows rose. Hunter's jaw clenched. Luna's smile turned into a smirk. A letter? Someone scoffed. That's all you get. Laughter, sharp, mocking, traced the room. I felt their cruelty like a current. Words like mockery, entitlement, and cruelty swirled. I remember holding the envelope and feeling absurdly comforted by Alice's hand. Her script had the intimacy of a woman writing in the blue hours, of decisions made at night when the rest of the house slept. Their laughter could be louder than my pulse, but as they whispered about cars and deposits, a small ember of hope glowed inside me. Hope is a stubborn thing when you are 71 and hollowed by loss, but it came, a warmth that suggested Alice had not left everything in plain sight. Perhaps there was more than the sentence printed in the will. That night I carried the sealed letter home like contraband. The Victorian house where we had lived held relics. Her reading chair, the teacup she favored, the garden path she tended. I set the envelope on the kitchen table and sat with it until midnight. Grief made me slow but also careful. I smoothed the paper with tentative fingers, as if being gentle would preserve a truth. When I broke the wax seal, I found Alice's voice again. Calm, precise. She wrote with the economy of a woman who had made peace with choices and wanted to leave instructions, not arguments. Taped inside the page was a zinc-coated key. Seeing it altered my pulse. A small metal thing that spoke of secrets and custody. Words like trust, secret, and resolve tasted heavy. I did not yet understand the full meaning, but the key suggested a direction. Alice had left me something she could not trust anyone else with. The knowledge settled into me like purpose. For the first time since the funeral, I felt a tide of resolve. I slept with the letter under my pillow that night, not because it was comforting, but because it felt like a plan. The children's laughter echoed. Their mockery was a reminder of the coldness I had been living with secretly for years. Alice's words seemed to breathe from the paper. She had wanted me to have power to choose our legacy. At dawn I dressed and thought of safes and banks and the way secrets live quietly beneath the surface. The funeral had exposed only the public face of our lives. The sealed letter promised another story deeper down. I folded the envelope into my pocket and left for Savannah Bank with the small zinc key warming against my palm. After the will, their world brightened like carnival lights. Hunter's new car sat like a beast in his driveway. Aiden posted photos on a yacht. Luna started suggesting I downsize my house as if it were practical advice and not an eviction notice. The town's attention shifted toward them. Invitations and favors followed the $22 million. I felt invisible at my own wake. Their treasures rubbed against the life Alice and I had built. New furniture replaced old memories. A deliveryman once waved at me like I was already gone. Words like entitlement, arrogance, and cruelty settled into daily conversation. They came with contractors' estimates and confident smiles. Their visits thinly veiled attempts to manage my affairs. "Maybe it's time you considered assisted living," Luna suggested once, casually, as if reading from a brochure. The sentence landed like a verdict. Hunter bragged about purchases. Aidan discussed investments with an appetite I had never seen. Their laughter carried mockery. Neighbors shifted. A cousin began offering help with my affairs. A realtor called with tidy offers. Each suggestion felt like a small push toward exile. Money had made the town forget we were two people with a shared life, not a ledger entry. Yet beneath the surface I held a secret weight. Alice's letter and the zinc key taped inside. While they displayed wealth, I possessed proof that Alice had been thinking several moves ahead. The key felt like a compass, and suddenly the glitter of their cars looked less substantial than a single piece of metal and a few lines of handwriting. I returned to Camilla for counsel. In her office, surrounded by legal books, I asked if the children could move assets or take control before probate concluded. Camilla's answer was calm. Transfers show, joint titles matter. Alice had been meticulous. She did not seem surprised by my mention of a key. She planned carefully, she said, and she left protections. Her words steadied me. I told her I had a key but not where it led. Camilla promised discretion and set to work quietly. The kind of ally who reads ledgers like others read letters. Her presence made me feel less alone in a household that had become a theater of entitlement. The children's behavior grew bolder. They asked to inventory the house, to see accounts, to help with paperwork. Their visits now came with lawyers' talk and veiled threats about competence. "We only want what's fair," Hunter said, and I heard the lie in every syllable. Their demands were wrapped in concern, but concern had become an instrument of control. At night I walked the garden Alice had tended and weighed what she had entrusted to me. The zinc key lay warm in my coat pocket, quiet and resolute. I found myself measuring the value of paper against the value of trust. The letter's paper had a weight no check could match. Alice's handwriting felt like a map drawn from love and suspicion both. There were days I wanted to explode, to confront them, to denounce them in the town square, to throw their keys and toys into the road. But Alice had taught me another kind of vigilance. She believed strength was measured in restraint, not spectacle. If she had left me this key, it was not for show. It was a choice. So I practiced patience. I did not flaunt what I had. I did not ask for sympathy. Instead, I prepared quietly. Papers sorted, questions framed, allies cultivated. I would not be hurried into a smaller life. I would not be shunted aside by their arrogance. Small mercies remained: a teenager who collected my mail, a cashier who asked after Alice and offered a whispered sympathy. Those quiet acts showed me not everyone had been seduced by money. Between the glare of public spectacle and the privacy of our truth were daily witnesses to what legacy really meant. That fragile conviction steadied me as I buttoned my coat. When I walked to Savannah Bank, I carried not just a key but the responsibility Alice had entrusted to me and a sense of duty. Savannah Bank smelled of paper and cold metal. I walked into that polished hall with the zinc key heavy in my fist and felt like a man taking off a disguise. The clerk slid the safe deposit box toward me like a secret being surrendered. Inside were rubber-banded folders, a worn leather journal, and another letter in Alice's hand. The journal bore her initials and the weight of a life kept in margins. When I read the letter first, her handwriting was steady. She had catalogued properties, hidden investment accounts, and stakes in businesses I had never known. The combined worth of those holdings eclipsed the $22 million. It was not just money. It was a map. Alice's journal read more like a quiet strategy and sorrow. She recorded dates, names, and decisions. She wrote plainly of disappointment. They have loved inheritance more than love. When illness made him fragile, they measured him by what he could not provide. I will not let greed be our story. The sentence landed where grief had dug its trenches and filled them with resolve. Between the ledgers and deeds I found legal instruments, contingent trusts, joint decision clauses, and penalties designed to discourage impulsive litigation. In plain terms, Alice had protected assets from hasty transfer and set barriers for anyone seeking to seize control without cause. It was as if she had anticipated the exact architecture of covetousness. There were small human things too. Folded photographs, ticket stubs, and notes about moments I had forgotten. One scrap read like a prayer. "Easton, you are stronger than you know." Another line. "Give yourself the power to choose. Do not rush to punish. Choose to protect." That voice, precise, tender, practical, felt like a hand on my shoulder. The ledger entries surprised me with their breadth. Properties held under corporate names, investment accounts tucked into trusts in different states, and rental portfolios meant for long-term stewardship rather than immediate spend. Alice had layered protection that required deliberation to unravel. Exactly the slow burn that would frustrate anyone trying to grab assets in a panic. Anger and relief mixed inside me. Relief because Alice had not left me nothing. Anger because she had felt she must hide what should have been shared. I felt a surge of power and a precise anxiety. With discovery came the responsibility of guardianship. Power without wisdom is dangerous. At 71, I had become a steward for a future I might never see. I thought of the children's laughter and understood why Alice had acted. The journal contained notes of small betrayals, conversations overheard, promises broken, each entry a diagnosis. There was moral architecture in her writing. She had not hidden wealth to deprive. She had hidden it to protect an ideal. In the margin she had written the line that would be my lodestar. If even one's soul remains uncorrupted, then our legacy is safe. I read it until it settled. When I left the bank, folders clutched under my arm. The world seemed less simple. Camilla would need to review everything. There would be choices to make guided by law and steadiness. The key had not unlocked mere dollars. It had unlocked obligation. Camilla and I mapped the holdings. There were rental properties recorded under corporate names, partnership shares in a small engineering firm, and investment accounts placed in trusts spanning several states. Some titles required consecutive legal steps to transfer. Others had been placed behind nominee entities. Camilla placed temporary holds where the law allowed and arranged for a neutral fiduciary to secure originals offsite. She also drew instruments that would make it hard to secure power of attorney without rigorous medical proof. I left the bank with that ledger in my coat and a new kind of heartbeat. Not the hollow of grief, but the steady thrum of duty. Alice had not given me mere inheritance. She'd given me a task. The zinc key had open possibility, and I would not waste it. I brought the folders and journal to Camilla's office the next morning, folding the papers beneath my coat. Her office smelled of coffee and law books. She listened without surprise as I laid everything on her desk. Watching her read felt like watching a surgeon at work. Careful, precise. Camilla moved through Alice's documents with reverence. She was methodical, she said. This isn't simply wealth. It's a structure. Contingency triggers, trust vehicles, and joint decision clauses. She made impulsive transfers difficult. The phrase sounded technical, but it meant protection. We made a plan. Secure the originals with an independent fiduciary. Create certified copies. Identify movable accounts and those bound by title. Prepare legal instruments to deter challenges to my competence. Camilla's steadiness felt like shelter. We acted quietly. Camilla arranged irrevocable trusts requiring multiple signers and set up escrow accounts for obligations that might otherwise appear as liquid funds. Alice's notes simplified the work. Her foresight guided each maneuver. She had not only hidden assets, she had scaffolded them. At home I kept a passive face. The children noticed patterns. Hunter commented on receipts. Luna asked about unfamiliar names on documents. They began bringing lawyers for preventative discussions. Their civility was thin. Suspicion had crept into their eyes. They also started searching in small ways, asking to inventory the house, helping sort closets, picking through drawers for anything to discredit me. Once, Hunter opened a drawer and rifled through my papers as if searching for a misplaced bill. That brazenness marked a boundary crossed. Camila advised restraint. "Let them make noise," she said. "We need silence and unassailable safeguards." So I tolerated their indignities and concealed the work beneath a frail facade while legal barricades rose in the background. Small kindnesses persisted despite the storm. A neighbor watered the garden. A cousin offered to help with forms. These acts were thin threads of humanity that kept me steady. They reminded me not everyone had been seduced by money. Camila and I mapped the holdings. There were rental properties recorded under corporate names, partnership shares in a small engineering firm, and investment accounts placed in trusts spanning several states. Some titles required consecutive legal steps to transfer. Others had been placed behind nominee entities. Camila placed temporary holds where the law allowed and arranged for a neutral fiduciary to secure originals offsite. She also drew instruments that would make it hard to secure power of attorney without rigorous medical proof. Her warning proved prescient. Within days, Luna suggested I sign vague paperwork to simplify things. Hunter casually asked for a list of household assets, and Aiden began calling professionals to appraise property values. Their civility was a mask for probing. They tested boundaries by requesting access to closets and drawers, claiming they were merely helping. Once, Hunter opened a locked drawer and rifled through personal papers as if searching for a receipt. That brazenness signaled a new phase. We started documenting everything. Dates, visitors, questions, and oddities in the house. It felt humiliating to catalog indignities, but necessary. The journal became our blueprint. Alice had anticipated this behavior and structured protections accordingly. Her legal scaffolding required time and deliberation, precisely the opposite of their impatient lust. Still, some blows were sharp. A daughter mentioned assisted living as casual counsel. A son asked whether I could handle bills alone. These thinly veiled threats carried arrogance and desperation. Camila advised restraint. Keep calm, avoid confrontation, let the law and Alice's design do the work. So I kept my face calm and my actions deliberate. I would not be hurried into exile. I would tend the trusts, guard the journal, and let patience become our strongest defense. I intended to see Alice's plan through, no matter the cost. Their new lives were a parade I could not escape. Social media became their stage. Hunter's yacht photos, Aiden's mountains of vacation snaps from Iceland, Luna's glossy posts of designer bags and sunlit terraces. Each image felt like a message aimed at me. Look what you did not protect. Look what you forfeited. The display was deliberate, an exhibition of entitlement meant to wound. They visited more often, though not to comfort. Their presence was transactional. Conversation punctuated by suggestions that felt like thinly veiled eviction notices. "Dad, we can find a place that's more manageable for you," Luna said once, as if offering kindness. But the tone beneath the words was insistent. They had a rhythm now. Come, observe, suggest, retreat. The town began to mirror their posture. The more they flaunted, the bolder their intrusions became. Hunter asked to see account statements, Aiden requested access to insurance papers, and Luna started to catalog household items as if preparing a sale. One afternoon, the two brothers opened the attic door and left it ajar. Later I found boxes rearranged and a family quilt missing its usual place. The sense of being erased from one's life is more violent than a slap. Their tactics sharpened into strategy. They would test me with small requests and note my responses, looking for lapses to exploit. Friends would arrive with them, smiling thinly while they probed for information. Once, while I made tea in the kitchen, a contractor arrived with Hunter and asked about a necessary repair that seemed designed to justify transferring funds. It felt like a slow siege. There were more dangerous moves beneath the polite surface. I heard hints of conversations where competence was discussed as if it were a condition one could file paperwork to change. The phrase medical evaluation began to appear in messages on my phone. A stranger called claiming to be from a care facility offering assessment. It was a methodical approach. Create doubt about my faculties, present an option framed as compassion, then push for legal mechanisms to shift control. I had to be clever. Outwardly, I played the part of the gentle, forgetful elder. I let them see me as soft and slipping. Inside, I was working. Camila set up procedures to require medical certifications and independent evaluations before any power of attorney actions could proceed. We stationed certified copies of documents with neutral parties and ensured all critical titles were blocked from facile transfer. Still, the emotional toll was heavy. My children's arrogance, entitlement, and hostility felt like a daily corrosion. It hurt to be treated as if age were a liability to be leveraged. When Luna suggested assisted living for convenience, it landed like contempt wrapped in concern. Each thin smile became a small brutality. I met their barbs with measured answers. If Hunter wanted a house inventory, I arranged time with Camila and recorded everything. If Aiden requested drivers' names for insurance, I diverted to a certified agent. The more they probed, the more careful I became. My calm was armor. There were moments of private fury. Once, I imagined taking all their car keys and tossing them into the river. Another night I considered confronting them publicly and listing every slight, every mocking laugh. But Alice had taught me a different cruelty. That restraint, not spectacle, wins wars that matter. I remembered her voice. Give yourself the power. The memory steadied me. I also began to notice which friendships remained. Mrs. Peters from down the lane, who had baked for Alice when she was sick, stopped by without asking. Her small visits and quiet offers to weed the flower beds reminded me that not everyone had been corrupted by greed. Those gestures were oxygen. With Camila's counsel, we tightened the legal screws and created a record of intrusions. Each petty theft, each odd contractor call, each suggestion of incompetence was logged. We prepared for what would come because I understood that suspicion begets hostility, and hostility begets legal action. We would not be surprised. At night, I held Alice's journal and read the lines that had guided my choices. Her handwriting was a ledger of love and strategy. Meticulous, unromantic, and effective. She had given me tools. I was learning to use them. My children's laughter was still a wound, but beneath it I felt the anchor of purpose. Suspicion had been planted like a seed. It was now growing into a vine that threatened everything. My job was to prune it before it strangled the whole garden. I would let the facade of frailty hang about me while the architecture Alice left quietly did its work. In that silence lay the best chance of preserving truth and protecting what mattered most. I would not yield to greed. They came to me like weather I could not predict, my grandchildren arriving at my door with a loyalty that felt rare in a season of greed. Mia was the first to appear, eyes wide and steady, her hand gripping a small phone as if it contained fragile proof. Tyler and Axel followed, quiet in the way that surprises you with its weight. I had known these boys and this girl as children of my children, but in them I found a tenderness that had nothing to do with inheritance. They sat across from me at the kitchen table where Alice had kept her recipe cards and spoke like allies. Not pitying me, but seeing me. The word kindness barely covers what they offered. An unvarnished fidelity that warmed the cold places the adult world left behind. Grandpa, Mia said, voice small. We need to tell you something. Her fingers trembled with a recording. I took the phone and listened to the conversation. My children, my own sons and daughter, plotting to declare me incompetent, arranging evaluations and legal steps to seize control. The phrase medical assessment repeated, the tone clinical and ruthless. The recording was a blade that cut through denial. I felt betrayal again, but not the naive shock of the funeral. This was anger met with clarity and a plan. Their loyalty was not mere sentiment. It was action. They had watched quietly, between school and life's obligations. They had seen whispers in corners and small cruelties that the world mistook for generational friction. They had recorded a plan not out of malice, but to protect me from a system their parents evidently valued more than their father. I thought of Alice writing, if even one soul remains uncorrupted, our legacy is safe. In that kitchen, slanting afternoon light, the grandchildren became that single soul because they refused to let greed be the final voice of the family. Mia confessed that their parents had grown proud in money and small in care. They say you're too fragile, she whispered. They say they'll do it for your good. The air carried those phrases like a warning. I felt a bruise where trust had been, but the grandchildren's courage filled the space with something else. Purpose. Their bond with me felt like a new ledger of truth countering the tally of greed, and it changed how I would respond. We planned quietly. Camila would need to formalize our evidence. Trust documents would be secured and witnesses recorded. Mia handed me copies of messages. Tyler described overheard phone calls, and Axel brought a notebook with dates and times. Their hope was practical. Gather proof and document the intrusion. The phrase truth anchored each action. I had been the man shielding others. Suddenly I was shielded by those I thought of as young, and their steady help turned despair into resolve. It was strange to be protected by the generation I had assumed would be shaped by the same vanity as their parents. They had watched differently. Where my children had been impatient, these young ones listened. Where the older generation had measured value in displays, my grandchildren measured in fidelity. I felt my resolve harden in their presence. Less vengeful, more strategic. I was 38 years Alice's husband and now an older man with allies who prized trust and bond over quick riches and shallow applause. Alice's journal became a teaching tool. I read aloud passages about debt, contingencies, and what she had feared. The grandchildren absorbed it like scripture. If even one's soul remains uncorrupted, I repeated, and the line seemed to make itself real in the faces across from me. They promised to stand with me when questions were asked. Their promise felt like a bridge built from loyalty and the need for justice. Their support was not blind. They challenged me to use the journal not as a relic but as evidence and a strategy. "We don't want to see you taken," Tyler said bluntly. Axel, who had been shy as a boy, surprised me by asking about legal terms and the kinds of proof the court would consider convincing. They had researched quietly, not because they loved law but because they loved me. Their strength surprised me anew and taught me how to turn tenderness into defense. We set a plan. Gather documents, record intrusions, and let Camila thread everything together. I felt less alone. The grandchildren's loyalty altered the shape of battle. No longer was I simply defending what Alice had left. We were defending a moral inheritance. For the first time since the funeral, hope felt steadier. With Mia, Tyler, and Axel by my side, truth took root and my resolve sharpened. We were ready to meet the coming fights with patience, paperwork, and steady courage Alice had taught me. Alice's handwriting was a map to a life I had assumed had been fully visible. Reading it aloud to my grandchildren, I discovered how alive her foresight remained and how methodical her protection was. We gathered in the parlor where sunlight warmed the old piano. Camila had authorized careful sharing, and the children sat with reverence. The journal's pages cracked at my fingertips. Her notes were granular. Dates, account numbers, companies with innocuous names, and the reasoning behind each choice. The language was both legal and intimate. She separated affection from stewardship to prevent opportunism. Alice had written about their greed with precise observations. A line struck me. Greed wears a friendly face when it knows it has the upper hand. The grandchildren listened, their eyes moving between her script and me as if they were watching the constellation of our lives align. Her voice through ink explained why she had built layers of trusts, why she had set contingent penalties designed to deter lawsuits. Alice had not abandoned generosity. She had complicated it with guardrails so that stewardship required thought rather than hunger. Reading her journal aloud made the writing seem alive. Her admonitions about patience, do not rush to punish, choose to protect, echoed in the room. The grandchildren absorbed these aphorisms not as quaint maxims but as tactical advice. She wanted stability, Mia said softly. She wanted to be sure the money didn't buy what it shouldn't, silence or control. That observation cut to the heart of the matter. This was not about wealth but about preserving truth and dignity for future hands. The grandchildren asked the questions adults often avoid. Why didn't she tell us? Axel asked. I said simply, she did tell one person, me. She trusted I'd act with care. The answer satisfied them. Their respect for Alice's design revealed their maturity and underscored why she had chosen this path. They saw the logic and felt the tenderness beneath it. They were not naive about motive. They were committed to protecting the moral thread Alice had sewn through her legal structures. Camila explained legal tactics Alice had embedded. Contingent clauses would impose debts and liabilities if the children contested Easton's competence, a mechanism to deter opportunism. Trusts held property in layers, dissolved only by decisions aligned with stated values. Some investments required multi-party consent. Others lived in corporate shells that masked immediate temptation. It was complex by design. Alice's foresight had been both practical and moral, balancing aversion to folly with the hope of stewardship by the uncorrupted. Alice's journal also contained small stories, memories of our life that were not ledger lines. The night we danced in the kitchen, the old dog we buried behind the shed, the way she always left a note in my coat pocket. These scraps were anchors she left to remind us what the money was for and who we were. When I read these, the grandchildren laughed softly, and their loyalty felt less like obligation and more like affection that could survive hardship. They wanted concrete steps. We listed assets named in the journal and mapped each to a legal avenue Camilla could use. Mia took responsibility for emails and messages, archiving them in both digital and printed form. Tyler compiled dates, bank correspondences, and bank teller interactions he had noticed. Axel cross-referenced owners' names and property tax records in county filings. Camilla taught them how to notarize witness statements and prepare affidavits that would be admissible in court. They learned how to produce originals or certified copies where possible, and to organize material so it would be clear and usable. I explained to them why Alice had cloaked some holdings. Protection is not theft but prudence. The grandchildren absorbed the lesson and debated with me about mercy and consequence. They did not want revenge. They wanted stewardship. We rehearsed how each would speak if called upon, and they practiced the measured tone Alice favored. Calm, factual, and without flourish. Their seriousness steadied me further, and I realized explicitly then how Alice's moral project had created not only legal structures but pedagogical ones as well. She intended heirs who would understand duty, not merely spend impulsively. At night I reread Alice's concluding lines. If even one soul remains uncorrupted, then our legacy is safe. In the faces of Mia, Tyler, and Axel, the line felt realized. They had not sought to profit. They had sought to preserve. Their loyalty was the living proof Alice had hoped for, and the journal's words guided us toward a legal strategy rooted in truth and kindness rather than revenge. I learned to move like someone practicing a role. Frail, forgetful, the image the world expected. While beneath the costume I rebuilt the scaffolding that would keep Alice's intentions intact and unseized. The performance began with small things. Misplacing keys, using a slower voice, suggesting forgetfulness as if it were a kindness. In public I let the kids see glimpses of a man who might be easier to push aside. The facade served two purposes. It lowered suspicion and shielded the legal maneuvers Camilla orchestrated out of sight. Let them underestimate you, Alice had written, and so I did, though my interior was all calculation and care. Behind closed doors, Camilla and I worked in a tempo that felt clandestine. We moved assets into irrevocable trusts, drafted clauses that required medical certification for power of attorney changes, and secured independent fiduciaries. We placed certified copies of deeds with neutral parties and arranged for staggered transfers that could not be executed without multiple signatories. Each action was a stitch in a tapestry designed to resist a sudden, greedy hand and to ensure that control would require deliberation and character. Pretending frailty required discipline. At family dinners I let my voice drift. I lost threads of conversation purposefully. When Hunter arrived with friends, I smiled and nodded to avoid suspicion. Yet my hands were steady when Camilla called. I signed documents and initialed instructions that would become quiet fortresses. That dissonance became a small, effective tool. Their hunting changed. Where previously their raids were bold, they became more tentative, cautious of showing too much. They tested me with small requests. Can we look at insurance? And I supplied controlled, recorded access. Camilla advised we always provide documentation through certified channels. We complied, but on terms that favored transparency and defense. Their impatience revealed itself in opportunities to document their intrusions and add them to our dossier. I started to use the house differently. I left certain rooms visible and others locked with explanations about old boxes. When Luna insisted on cataloging my belongings, I offered a polite schedule and recorded each interaction. If Hunter lingered in the library, I ensured a neighbor or the grandchildren would be present. Alice's journal guided these micro-decisions. Her admonition to choose protection became my tactical refrain and an ethic. We refined tactics to make the house itself a record of daily life. I installed a ledger binder on the kitchen island for visitors to sign when they came to help. Camila suggested we send certified letters when people asked for access to documents. Their replies would become part of the paper trail. We also used modest technology. Time-stamped photos of rooms, scanned receipts, and a secure digital backup of Alice's journal stored with a law firm in another state. Emotionally, the ruse of frailty was harder than I expected. I had to catch myself when pride rose, when the urge to confront boiled like a pot. Instead, I learned to write down offenses, to let the journal carry the memory so anger would not cloud testimony or evidence. The grandchildren helped in odd, intimate ways. Mia would bring tea and listen while I wrote affidavits from memory. Tyler would sit with me to ensure dates were precise. Axel would fetch original documents from locked boxes and carry them gently to Camila's car. Their small rituals made the legal fight human, anchoring it with tenderness and methodical habit. Strangely, my feigned weakness granted me freedom. People rushed to help, revealing their true faces. Some were kind, neighbors, the mailman, while others came with layers of calculation. By letting them see a man who might be easily moved, I watched who moved with care and who moved like a predator. The evidence of motive accumulated naturally, turning petty arrogance into documentary proof. The grandchildren took on roles too. Mia would sit with me and ask casual questions while cameras logged. Tyler learned to note dates. Axel handled the physical inventory. Their presence validated the narrative we planned to present if challenge morphed into litigation. We were constructing a story that matched the truth. Not a tale of ailing neglect, but a pattern of entitlement exercised by those who sought immediate reward and who mistook wealth for inheritance of character. At night, I lay awake thinking about the cruelty that had driven Alice to hide assets. She had known the sting of desertion in the face of illness. She had chosen to act. My act was to honor her by being patient where my heart wanted to be blunt. The facade of frailty was a shield for strategy. It was also, perhaps, a small mercy. It kept confrontations quiet and prevented careless provocations that could complicate legal defenses. I would keep the performance until the law and truth could intersect to protect what mattered most. When the summons arrived, it felt like a stage curtain snapping open. My children had filed papers, and the quiet war turned public with the thrust of legal force. The town's small chorus of opinion waited like an audience. They accused me of hiding assets, of being unfit to manage what Alice had left, and of orchestrating secrecy. Their lawyers painted a portrait of a frail man hoarding treasures, an image they hoped would sway a judge with sympathetic concern. I watched their statements as if reading lines in a play I had not written and felt something like pity that they believed cunning would replace kindness. Their strategy depended on perception, and perception is often more persuasive than truth if untethered by evidence. The courtroom was a cold theater. Camila stood at my side with a calm that felt like armor. The gallery contained neighbors, the town's opinion makers, and my grandchildren, Mia, Tyler, and Axel, quietly present with notebooks and honest faces. Their presence steadied me. They watched as my children, once smug and cavalier at the will reading, transformed into actors rehearsing indignation designed to appeal to civic sensibility and the judge's empathy. Their strategy was blunt. Question my competence, claim sudden confusion, suggest medical decline. They measured out anecdotes. Missed appointments, a misplaced check, an elderly man who seemed lost in thought. Each detail was a chip to carve away the image of stewardship. Their lawyers wielded concern like a sword, keenly attuned to public sympathy and legal sentiment. It was procedural cruelty disguised as care, and I could almost see the choreography behind their polite faces. Camila moved with a different rhythm. She presented Alice's journal, trust documents, and the folder from Savannah Bank. She traced Alice's foresight, contingent liabilities tied to the $22 million, trust structures guarded by multi-party consent, and escrowed assets not subject to impulsive transfer. Where their arguments sought sympathy, Camila summoned the architecture Alice had built, each clause, signature, and dated note a bulwark against opportunistic seizure. Evidence mattered. Mia testified to the recording. Tyler recounted dates with clear memory. Axel described small acts that, strung together, painted a picture of intent and pattern. Their simple, unadorned accounts offered a contrast to the polished indignation of the plaintiffs. I watched the judge take notes, his face a study in legal neutrality. The moment felt less like drama and more like a measured weighing of facts. Cross-examination had its sharp moments. A lawyer asked me, with feigned concern, whether I had trouble managing daily tasks. I answered clearly, citing recent medical records and my own daily routines. In that straight answer I felt a small victory. The truth, stated plainly, often deflates manufactured concern. Camilla punctured their insinuations with certified evidence. Bankholds, notarized copies, and third-party affidavits. She showed how Alice had anticipated opportunism and had deliberately complicated transfers to demand deliberation, not quick grabs. The judge's face was not cruel. He was simply exacting. At one point he turned to the counsel and said, "Estate plans can be complicated. Prove harm, not intent." That comment undercut the para-language of pity the plaintiff sought. Camilla highlighted the specificity of Alice's dates, the notarized entries, and the corporate registration stamps that proved decades of careful planning. The legal record we had compiled made opportunistic claims seem, in contrast, hurried and self-interested. The Children's Counsel tried to conflate normal aging with incapacity, but the medical records and my daily accounts undermined that narrative. Outside, the town watched the slow unspooling. For the first time, my children's laughter at the will looked reckless rather than triumphant. The public theater had been met with a sturdier script, and in that steadiness I found a new kind of power. Truth, not spectacle, began to shape the outcome. When Camilla finally unrolled the hidden clauses in open court, it felt like a trap snapping shut, but it was a trap Alice had designed to protect truth, not to punish the honest. She explained how the $22 million had been conditioned by liabilities. Tax escalators, contingent debts, and penalty clauses that activated when litigation was initiated without substantiated cause. She walked the judge through the corporate shells Alice had used, the staggered transfers, and the escrow accounts whose purposes were to cover liabilities and protect long-term stewardship. The legalese read like a labyrinth, but its moral was simple. Challenge recklessly, and what you think is a windfall will be exposed as a potential liability you must manage. The children watched as the smile of entitlement faltered. Their counsel tried to argue that these clauses were punitive and unnecessary, but Camilla pointed out how common such mechanisms are in careful estate planning, especially when the decedent suspected predatory impulses. Alice's design had been to make sudden grabs costly and to demand deliberation rather than impulse. It forced not just prudence but character. News traveled quietly at first, letters to close contacts, a neighbor's whisper, and then in louder ripples as liens and notices hit inboxes. Hunter's yacht showed a sudden lien. Luna's new home had its mortgage recalculated in a way that exposed hidden liabilities she had not anticipated. Aiden's investment partner withdrew pending offers as risk recalculations swept through the small financial networks they had believed impenetrable. The town's whispers turned into focused conversations about unpaid schedules and unanticipated obligations. It was wrenching to watch greed become its own undoing. The luxury cars my children flaunted were now attachments with payment schedules and insurance costs tied to cash flows. Their vacations, once the subject of social media envy, became unwise expenditures when long-term liabilities surfaced. The town that had smiled at their extravagance began to murmur about responsibility and overreach. For some, schadenfreude hovered. For others, there was genuine concern for a family unraveling publicly. Alice's strategy had not been purely punitive. She had created ways to preserve dignity if heirs chose stewardship, pathways to satisfy obligations, plans for repayment, and options for structured management. The mechanism required prudence. Those who could demonstrate judgment might keep holdings, but those who had squandered would face consequences. Her plan demanded accountability rather than blind reward. The first real fallout arrived with foreclosure notices and lien filings. Hunter's property entered a pre-foreclosure status. Luna faced a recalculation that stripped away some equity. Aiden's business commitments were renegotiated under stress. Each notice was a ripple that widened into a wave of consequence. Watching them scramble was a complex sorrow. There was a lesson being taught, but it was being taught painfully. In private, Hunter came to the porch one evening, hat in hand, voice raw. "Dad," he said, eyes red. "I didn't understand. We were careless. We were reckless. Please." It was a plea stripped of entitlement. I listened, the ache of betrayal sitting alongside the ache of compassion. It is a strange thing to feel mourning for a loss you did not cause and regret for children who had chosen the wrong measure of worth. Camila advised measured mercy. We can offer limited assistance, she said, but we must protect the long-term plan. We provided temporary shelter and small stipends to tide them through immediate hardship. Mercy, in this case, meant not wiping away consequence but easing immediate pain while preserving the lesson Alice intended. I offered them rooms and rules, not carte blanche and not the forgiveness they had traded away through earlier contempt. We moved quickly to insulate the trusts for the grandchildren. Camila structured distributions tied to education and civic engagement, stipulating mentorship and oversight so that wealth would be accompanied by instruction. We appointed prudent trustees. Seeing these measures in place, I felt both relief and responsibility. Alice had not wanted blind riches passed down. She had wanted a legacy that taught the next generation how to steward privilege responsibly. In that, I honored her and preserved what mattered beyond money. Ruin did not arrive with a single thunderclap. It came like winter light, slowly, inevitable, and merciless. I watched my children unravel in ways that were both shocking and painfully deserved. After the court's reasoning surfaced Alice's contingencies, small creditors and tax notices began to show up like relentless rain. Hunter's yacht, which had once glinted on social feeds like a trophy, now had a lien that made marina slips a nightmare. Luna's glossy new home had recalculations that stripped away the sudden equity she thought secure. Aiden's business partners called meetings and withdrew offers once they understood the legal architecture Alice had put in place. The word ruin is clumsy for the dread I felt watching their world totter, because there is a private sorrow in seeing your children reduced to mistakes that were born of entitlement and arrogance. They had treated the $22 million as entitlement, not responsibility. The cars and trips looked glamorous but were bought on leverage and assumption. When liabilities appeared, taxes, penalties, and escrow shortfalls, their fragile finances cracked. What followed was not a sudden collapse but slow erosion. Creditors, missed payments, and eroded credit that turned display into liability. It pained me to watch. Pity did not erase the lessons their arrogance taught. They had treated the inheritance as a prize, not as a load to bear with prudence. The social currency they purchased with borrowed money turned into a quick corrosion of relationships. Friends who once attended launches and large dinners began to distance themselves when notices appeared. I saw Hunter bargain with banks, watched Luna plead for refinancing, and listened as Aiden made excuses to partners who had lost patience. Their arrogance had always been the most dangerous thing. Entitlement makes a thin foundation. Practicalities crowded my days. Camila and I finalized trust instructions to isolate Alice's holdings, transferring critical assets into carefully governed entities and creating payment staircases to avoid immediate collapse of revenue streams. We established conservators for corporate interests that required professional oversight, and we moved investment accounts into entities that required multi-signatures before liquidation. My grandchildren's trusts were insulated with educational stipulations and mentorship clauses so that the next generation would learn stewardship, not entitlement. I instructed trustees to prioritize mentorship, financial courses, civic engagement requirements, and oversight by measured neutral parties. Even as I acted, sorrow followed. Watching them face foreclosure notices and lien filings was heartbreaking. Yet there was a grim relief. Alice's foresight had prevented the complete dispersal of the real legacy she and I had built. The title to family property, long-term investments, and business shares that mattered remained structured, not liquid, reserved for those who could steward them faithfully. When Hunter, hunched and hollow-eyed, asked for shelter, and Luna sent messages of contrition, I had to decide between simple compassion and the preservation of lessons. Camila advised measured assistance. Temporary shelter, modest stipends contingent on accountability, and counseling tied to concrete steps. Mercy must teach. It cannot undo consequence and still mean anything. I offered help that required proof of change, job searches, classes, and restitution plans, because mercy without consequence becomes a lesson unlearned. Throughout this unraveling, the grandchildren were a counterweight. Mia, Tyler, and Axel steadied my home. They juggled trustee meetings, filed paperwork, and carried out the practical tasks that kept life ordinary. Where my children had been defined by entitlement and arrogance, my grandchildren embodied trust, bond, and hope. Their fidelity was not sentimental but functional. Organized receipts, documented communications, and patient stewardship. Slowly, some creditors negotiated workable settlements and some assets were restructured into sustainable portfolios. The children lost status and many luxuries, but they retained a pathway to rebuild. Watching them learn cost me, and taught me that consequences, while painful, can be the most honest teacher. I did not gloat. I kept the ledger of responsibility and let the lessons be plain. They returned not as heirs but as supplicants. My children limping back into a home they had thought would be an endless resource. The rupture that had felt theoretical when the will was read became painfully real when their footsteps sounded on my porch. Hunter came first, shoulders stooped, eyes brighter in their hollowness. He spoke with a voice that betrayed nights of worry. Creditors calling, partners withdrawing support, bad counsel and bad choices. "Dad," he said, the apology small and raw, "I'm sorry. I didn't know how to keep it." The admission was a human thing, not a legal one, and it landed somewhere between shame and relief. Luna arrived with a suitcase and a gait that carried the weight of panic. Mortgage recalculations had eroded a down payment. Her messages were long confessions about impulsive purchases and poor advisors. Aiden sent terse, hurried texts, an attempt at salvage that read like damage control. The arrogance that had laughed at the will's sealed letter was gone. They wanted shelter, help, time, a restoration of safety rather than the reckless consumption they had once practiced. Forgiveness is complicated currency. I chose mercy but wrapped it in accountability. With Camila's counsel, we offered structured help. A temporary room, limited stipends tied to documented steps, mandatory financial counseling, and enrollment in stewardship courses. I refused to sign away the protections Alice had built. Mercy without structure would have become an evade for repeated error. The point was to teach, not enable. We had hard conversations about trust. I spoke about how wealth can corrode character when it is worshipped rather than stewarded. I told them plainly that privilege comes with duty. Sometimes their responses were raw and sincere. Other times old patterns flickered, requests for funds for necessary luxuries, excuses about poor advisors. I learned to read cadence and conviction. The phrase I said once, "You spent forgiveness long ago," was not an act of cruelty but a boundary. I gave them photographs and memories. Prints of birthdays, small heirlooms that held sentimental value but no leverage. Financial interests, title deeds, and the journal-led trusts remained with the grandchildren and appointed trustees. I wanted them to keep what nourished memory while losing the false security of easy access to capital. Neighbors watched with a blend of pity and relief. Some offered quiet meals. Others kept distance. The grandchildren supported their aunts and uncles in practical ways, helping file forms, reminding them of hearings, and bringing soup. Humility, when practiced, looked like small acts, the first steps to genuine repair. In the months that followed, modest change appeared. Hunter took a part-time job and began financial workshops. Luna enrolled in property management courses. Aiden sought counseling and started consulting intermittently. The progress was fragile and halting, but present. Mercy with accountability had opened space for learning. Not a fast redemption, but a scaffold for rebuilding. At night I reread Alice's journal and felt the intersection of sorrow and resolve. Mercy had its place, but not at the expense of truth. I had chosen to protect the moral architecture she had sown into our lives while granting my children the chance to learn inside those boundaries. It was a balance of justice and compassion, and in that balance I found a somber kind of peace. The day I rewrote the will felt less like a final act and more like the articulation of a promise. Alice's promise reinforced by my resolve. I sat in Camila's office with a pen that felt heavier than its weight, knowing each clause would shape futures. We drafted instruments with precision. Sentimental items, photographs, letters, a few small heirlooms, went to my children, things that carried memory but no liquid value. The bulk of assets, properties, and investment accounts were structured for Mia, Tyler, and Axel in irrevocable trusts. Distributions would be tied to milestones: degree completion, apprenticeship hours, and documented civic engagement. I wanted to ensure that inheritance came with instruction. Beyond sentiment, the legal scaffolding was intricate. We created dynasty-style trusts where permitted so assets could be stewarded across generations without easy liquidation. Family LLCs held real estate with buy-sell provisions favoring long-term management and requiring independent approval for any sale. Investment accounts were moved into structures permitting staggered distributions tied to milestones, education completion, civic engagement, and documented mentorship. Charitable triggers released funds only when grantees demonstrated measurable impact, making philanthropy accountable. I insisted on appointing guardians for trustees, a retired judge whose record suggested impartiality and a university professor skilled in nonprofit governance. These choices insulated the trusts from local pressures and cycles of entitlement. Camila added oversight clauses requiring biannual reports, independent audits, and conflict of interest prohibitions for trustee decisions. We included reconciliatory pathways, opportunities for heirs to regain portions of access through public acknowledgement of harm, financial restitution plans, and community service. The documents were pedagogical rather than punitive. They taught responsibility, restraint, and civic duty. As I signed, the act felt like pinning a map to the future. Legal lines that would teach and guide. I felt the gravity of finality and the clarity of conviction. Alice's legacy would endure as a living lesson, not an unexamined gift. Logistics required hard choices. Some properties were placed in family LLCs with buy-sell terms favoring long-term management rather than quick sale. Investment accounts used staggered schedules to avoid impulsive dissipation. Educational stipends required enrollment or approved vocational training. Charitable provisions demanded measurable results. Each clause had purpose: to cultivate stewardly habits and guard against the patterns that had harmed us. After signing, Camila and I planned communication. Calm, factual notifications to the extended family, with offers of mediation if disputes arose. The will was legal, but it was also moral instruction. Back home, I placed the journal where it belonged and added an addendum outlining trustee expectations. The signature felt like an act of guardianship, preserving love as instruction rather than commodity. That night I walked the garden and felt the clarity of having converted grief into stewardship. I had preserved what mattered. Alice's faith that courage, truth, and careful instruction could outlast the small cruelties of entitlement. Courage, I discovered, was an unglamorous habit more than a dramatic moment, a steady insistence on truth in the face of erosion and mockery. The work of restoration took practical, public form. We created a community fund overseen by trustees where Mia and Tyler learned to evaluate grant requests. Axel organized volunteer days at the food bank and the community center. These actions were steady, not spectacular. Monthly meetings, documented impact reports, and public updates that made philanthropy accountable. The grandchildren ran budgeting workshops at the high school and led discussions on stewardship, turning abstract ethics into daily practice for teens. Watching them teach showed me how values transmit through action rather than speech. My own days settled into a rhythm of caretaking and mentoring. Mornings I tended Alice's garden. Afternoons I reviewed trustee reports and handled correspondence. Evenings were for quiet conversations about responsibility. Neighbors shifted from gossip to offers of practical help, and local nonprofits requested pilot grants managed by the family fund. Even my children, in ways, began to take modest steps. Part-time jobs, apologies, and attendance at financial classes. The changes were halting, but steady, and the town began to notice a different pattern: repair rather than retreat. One weekly ritual anchored us. I read a passage from Alice's journal aloud and asked those present to reflect on one concrete choice they would make that week. The exercise was small. No ceremonies, practice, but it became a moral curriculum. Over time, the grandchildren's choices accumulated into visible habits: consistent giving, transparent reporting, and small acts of public service. That slow accrual felt like resilience built by courage in daily increments. There were scenes of gentle restoration around the neighborhood. The community center expanded job training. The school saved emergency funds. Local shelters received coordinated support. These quiet returns felt more meaningful than spectacle. Courage looked like showing up, being accountable, and choosing the patient work of repair each day. In that steady practice I found the clarity Alice wanted: That legacy is cultivated by action, not by the headline wealth that feeds short-term vanity. Alice's final words did not arrive as thunder. They arrived like a hand on my shoulder by the kitchen light, steady and deliberate. A week after I read Alice's note aloud, we held a small public forum. Camila and I explained the trust structures and the goals of the family fund. Trustees and a few neighbors joined to answer questions. The event was deliberate. Transparency to replace rumor. The trust's criteria, education, civic engagement, demonstrated stewardship, were presented carefully. People asked hard questions about fairness and oversight. Trustees answered with documents and promised reports. The forum felt like a civic clearing, a way to turn private pain into public accountability. Small results followed. A local teacher reported students saving small emergency funds after attending a workshop. A shelter received a modest grant that allowed it to pilot a job training course. The grandchildren led volunteer days and budget classes, modeling the habits Alice wanted taught. Those practical returns moved the town's conversation beyond scandal to service. The community's tone shifted as people looked for evidence of good work. Collaboration gradually replaced gossip. At home, I kept a nightly ritual. I read a passage and asked, "What will you do to honor truth?" The grandchildren answered with practical pledges: attend a class, volunteer, complete an application, and then acted on those promises. Renewal, I saw, occurs through repetition of small, steady acts. Forgiveness requires limits. I had given my children measured mercy, but I would not dissolve the responsibility that held lessons in place. The journal would guide the next generation, a curriculum of service, stewardship, and character. Alice's last sentence, about courage, truth, and the hearts we leave behind, became a test for choices small and large. At dusk on the porch, with the journal in my lap and Lily's breathing night air, I felt a hard-won peace. I had used Alice's key not to lock the past away but to open a path forward, one that taught responsibility, honored memory, and kept love from being reduced to an account. Her words settled into the long shape of our future, and in that steadiness I found the quiet of a legacy well guarded. What would you have done if your own family turned betrayal into a weapon against you? Do you believe dignity, justice, and legacy can truly be restored after greed and manipulation have ripped them apart? When independence collides with family loyalty, which one should prevail? And how far would you go to reclaim your respect when it has been stolen most cruelly? Share your thoughts with me in the comments. I want to know your perspective on betrayal, resilience, and what justice really means. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like mine, where every choice tests the very limits of truth and survival.